I think this is a very important adventure. And I think Jim outlined the problem very well. It's a daunting task, and it's a dangerous task, because the only thing worse than no reform is reform that is ill-considered or doesn't work, because change is not always progress. And so we have a dual burden. But I think, fortunately, my job this morning is not to tell us what we should do, but why we should do something. And I will carefully restrict myself to that side of it. As Jim pointed out, the first serious analysis and reform project culminated in the National Security Act of 1947. And it occurred because the Titanic struggle, which was World War II, had revealed serious fissures in the way we went about propelling our own interests in the world. The result was the creation of the NSC, CIA, and the intelligence community, the Air Force, Department of Defense. It was a massive project. And these structures served us well. They were not, it evolved. It has been in its present form since about 1970. Present form, little modifications around the edge, but not serious. But at the beginning, President Truman, for example, before the Korean War, refused to meet with the National Security Council because he considered it a derogation on his responsibilities as president. Eisenhower saw the NSC as a military staff system. Kennedy saw it as a small coterie of private advisors and so on. And so it went back and forth and evolved up and down until under Nixon it came to be a little bit of Eisenhower, a little bit of Kennedy, and it has retained that general structure since. So why change it? I think, again, Jim has put out the various reasons for it. But I think fundamentally the reason is that the world system for which the NSC was created and which it managed during the 40-odd years of the Cold War, obviously acceptably, has disappeared. And that disappearance has arisen out of factors and circumstances which that system, the system that we have, has increasingly difficulty coping with. Let me explain what I mean. I think the end of the Cold War marked what I would call a historical discontinuity. Because the world of the Cold War and the world which has succeeded the Cold War were virtual polar opposites to each other. The Cold War was a period of intense focus on what was essentially a single target. It mobilized all our efforts, and they were easily mobilized because it was clear what the threat was. It was clear where the threat emanated. We knew what we had to do. It wasn't always easy to do what we had to do. We had to get coalitions and we had to organize ourselves and so on. But basically, the objective was always right out there, clear and plain. Suddenly, in the historic blink of an eye, that world was gone. With it was gone the existential threat that we always face if we screwed up we could have a thermonuclear war. That was gone, and there was a great sense, really. That was gone, but so was the organizing principle on which we had operated. Because in place of this one overwhelming threat, there were dozens, hundreds of pinprick threats. And how to deal with them. And how serious were they? And we're still trying to adjust to that kind of world. In addition to that change in the political structure of the world, there are some forces going on that, some of them relative to the Cold War, some of them produced independently as the world evolved. But let me mention just a few that I think illustrate some of the problems that we face. The first one is the nature of war. In 1945, when you talked about war, you talked about interstate conflict between states or among groups of states. Uniforms, flags, organized groups. You fought, you won, you lost, so on. Talk about war now, and it predominantly means war inside states. Civil war, conflict among groups, conflict between states and non-state actors. It's a very different kind of conflict. And just to illustrate, and this is somewhat controversial, to describe the war on terror as a war perhaps brings up, there are reasons for it, because war is a great mobilizing factor. It brings up in people's minds a mental framework which is not appropriate for thinking about the current radical threat. It gets us into habits of mind, it gets us into organizational responses which may not be appropriate. So that's the first problem. And this is sort of preluding what I'm going to say. And this is happening just at the time when our Defense Department has probably honed its ability to deal with interstate war to the highest point we've ever had. Now, the second thing I would mention is the distribution of power in the world. Probably not since the Roman Empire has any state had so much military and economic power relative to the other entities, political entities in the world as we have. And frankly, we're not used to it. Because historically, we have not been on the forefront of the countries and groups of countries formulating the international system, its rules, its conduct, and so on. Secure behind our two oceans, we ordinarily waited, sat back, while the Europeans structured what the issues were and what the conflict was. Then we decided, yes, we'll get in. No, we won't get in. Yes, we'll get on this side. No, we'll get on that side. So we've been followers, not visionaries, not constructors of a world order. And suddenly, those countries that have fronted for us for a couple of hundred years are gone, and we're out there all alone. And as I say, we're still not used to it, and we have responded, as you all know, in very different ways to different problems. But neither is the rest of the world used to this kind of distribution of power, this very skewed perception of relative strength in the world. There's a natural reaction to it, the sort of biggest guy on the block reaction. There's a natural resentment. And people sort of take some satisfaction in seeing us taken down a notch just because we're so big. But I think there's another thing that has happened, partly because of our reaction and the world's reaction. And that is, we have lost something that we always used to have in the world. We've rarely had brilliant foreign or national security policies. But the rest of the world ordinarily thought, you know, they screw up a lot, but their heart's in the right place. They mean well, and so we got the benefit of the doubt. We no longer get the benefit of the doubt for all these reasons. Our behavior and the fact that we are so big. So we can't say, well, we kind of didn't do that exactly right, but people understand because they know we mean it. No more. No more. So we've got a double burden there. And the last thing I want to point out is to go back to this much overused word, globalization. And I'm talking not about globalization as a policy and the demonstrators out in front of the IMF and World Bank and so on, but globalization as a fact. National borders are eroding. Whether you look at the volume of capital flow that crosses borders every day, which is absolutely astonishing, whether you look at health issues, where a single passenger on an airplane could produce a world epidemic in about 48 hours because of our transportation systems. The environment you can no longer protect. Your air, water, whatever. Nationally. Commerce, the nature of international business is changing with impact domestically. And more important than all for our purposes, I think, is information technology. And what we have done is politicize the people of the world. I say we have done. What has happened? For most of man's history, the average person knew maybe what was going on in his own village and the next village, but no farther, and he didn't care much. So he was not stimulated by things that went on 5,000 miles away and so on. And now virtually everybody is within access of instant information. And the result is they're politicized. They react to what they see and hear. And they're pleased, they're mad, they're upset, they hate all of these things. And while this doesn't cause, for example, necessarily terrorism, it certainly has an impact on terrorism now versus terrorism when the Hashashis in Iran in the Middle Ages were killing people. So globalization is pervasive, and it is dramatically changing the way we have to react. We no longer have time. You know, 100 years ago, it took 3 weeks for, 150 years ago anyway, it took 3 weeks for a message to get from here to London, 3 weeks for it to get back, if the weather was good. And so, you had time to think about these things. You had time to do it. Now, something happens, and the reporter has a microphone in front of the president before he even knows what is going on. That's a dramatic change, and it means that the system has to react in ways that it never has before. One of the other impacts of globalization is that it makes the governance of weak states even harder than it was before. Because if strong states are powerless to control their borders and control the forces that go on, weak states are at the mercy of these forces and at the mercy of drug cartels and radical elements which defy their control. And the political talk has also led to a political atomization in the world. That is the tendency of groups that want to break up into ever smaller, ever more homogeneous groups. It is the opposite of the overall move toward globalization. And I think Yugoslavia is a prime case of that. Yugoslavia was a small state, maybe barely equipped to manage its people. Now it's 6. That is not a direction which helps the people in that state manage to deal with the world in which they find themselves. So all of these forces are going on simultaneously. To me, globalization now is akin to what industrialization, the impact that industrialization had 200 years ago. Industrialization sort of created the modern nation state, because with the powers of industry growing, all these forces developing, you had to have state regulation and so on to manage this. And I think globalization, maybe more gradually or less perceptibly, is having the same impact, but in the opposite direction. It is eroding the ability of the nation state to manage and to care for its people. So all of this, end of the Cold War, change in the world environment, and these forces result in the world that we have today. This is what we have to cope with. It is a world which is difficult to predict, difficult to manage. And again, as Jim said in his introductory remarks, we're attempting to cope with it with institutions and with habits of mind geared to the issues and problems of the world that we left, that is, the Cold War. Let me just mention a few. Well, I talked about Defense Department. Just at the time transformation was making the Defense Department into this awesome machine to fight on the North German plains, we now are kicking down doors in the dirtiest kind of low-level, in some respects low-level, conflict that we've ever had. We are unequipped to deal with the kind of warfare that is becoming so common, and that is the weak states, failing states, going into internal conflict, coming out of conflict, being needed to be reconstructed and put back on the course. We don't have institutions that can manage that. In the middle, states in conflict, we use a Defense Department. What do we use for states we think are failing? How do we prop them up? There's no one in charge. How do we do reconstruction? How are we doing it in Afghanistan right now? We don't have anyone who can be the military commander in the field for warfare. We set up a small shop in the State Department to do these kinds of things. A mid-level bureau in the State Department to run the U.S. government in a mixture of conflict, which is still going on and ending, and reconstruction, which needs to be beginning. Exactly what we're facing in Afghanistan now. You've got a war going on in Afghanistan. And what do you do in a war? Well, you find shots coming from a building over there, you call in an airstrike, and you wipe out the building. Lo and behold, there are 3 families living there. What does that do to your reconstruction and rehabilitation? There is no place inside this government with our stovepipes to do that sort of thing. NSC has gotten into operations only to its peril. intelligence community. Just to point out what I said about change is not always reform or progress. You know, the intelligence community is a good case in point. The intelligence community in the Cold War, again, focused on a single target, basically. And they got to do it pretty well. And we did, considering the complications of the opponent, we did quite well. Now, we're facing, again, the polar opposite question. Not a single target, but hundreds of targets. Targets you don't even know are targets until something happens. We didn't cover most of these areas before. We don't know how to do it. We're flooded with information that we get in. How do we process it? We don't really know. But what we did know is that we need to have more cooperation on the intelligence community. So we had an intelligence reform. Now, there are many different views about the intelligence reform, but I think it was not a work of Michelangelo. But it points out something. It started with some very good ideas, but even the best ideas have to go through our process. And so you have to figure out not only what's a good idea, but how you get it through the process without being torn limb from limb and produce something out here. This could even make the problem worse. The international community. That affects the way we look at things. We built an international community along the time that we were putting together a national security structure. We built IMF, World Bank, the UN, and so on. Again, all of them geared for a world which is gone. Even the issue of international versus domestic. In the National Security Act, we said the CIA will do foreign intelligence. The FBI will do domestic intelligence. And the twain shall not meet. And during the Cold War, it didn't matter very much because most of our real intelligence problems were overseas and our domestic intelligence problems were law enforcement problems. With terrorism, that border has vanished. Indeed, the terrorists are able to take advantage of it. So now you have not only the problem of two different bureaucracies working together, but they're two bureaucracies which over the years have developed very different mental frameworks for dealing with problems. The UN. The UN is an imperfect instrument. The United States has always had an ambivalent view of the UN, a love-hate relationship, which is probably as acute now as it has ever been. But this globalized world needs international organization. And I would suggest if there were no UN right now, we could not put together a United Nations. It would not be possible in 2008, 2007, to do what we did in 1945. So, what we've got is what we're going to have. And the question is how to make it work better. We have not done very well. The UN itself, when it was formed, it had 51 members. And they were all similar members in the sense that they were long-standing states or nation states or what have you. They all had similar sort of ways of doing things. There are now 192 members of the UN. Most of those additional ones either were non-existent when the UN was founded, or they were colonies or dependencies of the 51 with very different attitudes about the nation-state system, about the world structure. And now what you can see is an incipient struggle inside the UN between the Security Council run by the old states and the General Assembly, which controls the personnel and the purse strings, by the former colonial states. And that's a new kind of division that we have to cope with. The UN itself is deeply conflicted in this sense. Article 2 says that nothing in this charter gives the UN the right to interfere in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of its members. Okay? That's the sovereignty of the nation state is the bedrock on which the UN was created. But now we have developed, in following genocide conventions and things like that, a generally accepted responsibility to protect on the part of the UN. That when a state does not or cannot protect major elements of its population, it is the duty of the United Nations to intervene. Now those two are directly in conflict with each other. And one of the outcomes is Darfur. And Darfur is not just foot dragging and so on. Darfur is a conflict between these two. Sudan says, no, you may not come in. And China, which for its own reason believes that part of it, says no. And we're saying, but we have a responsibility to protect. There's a genocide going on. So we got huge problems with the UN. We have to make it work because it's all we have to try to ameliorate these multilateral problems which you cannot deal with bilateral. A couple of years ago there was an attempt at reform, and there was a program put forward that had some modest but very worthwhile proposals in it. About 2 days before it was formally submitted to the General Assembly, we submitted 700-something amendments. Not a constructive move. And so the reform pretty much fell flat. In sum, the problems with which we must cope are and have outrun the institutions we have available. It is certainly true that no readjusting of institutions and redrawing of wiring diagrams can make up for poor leadership, analysis, and strategy. But good structure can make good leadership even better. And that brings us to the project on national security reform. We do need a comprehensive review of the current and especially the projected national security environment. What is it that we have to cope with? What are these forces and how do we deal with them? Followed by an analysis of the structural and procedural changes which would more nearly align the organizational structures to the needs we must satisfy. Goldwater-Nichols was a pioneering effort in this kind of analysis and projection. As someone who played around on the fringes of it, it was hard work for a number of years. It was not easy. It succeeded. It has a few warts, but it succeeded, I think, beyond the optimistic dreams of most of those involved in its development. But we have to remember about Goldwater Nichols that it operated within the boundaries of a single department. And once it was agreed, it could be enforced by the Secretary of Defense. Reform of the NSC would not enjoy that, and therefore is subject to a lot of tinkering, even with the greatest of motives. At this moment, it's not part of my task here. At this moment, I don't have a particular vision in mind. I think the requirement is in part to enforce discipline. The almost inevitable bureaucratic instinct to do that is to proliferate people and to begin to replace the jobs that others do because you're impatient with the way they're doing it. And you end up with an institution which is as big and unwieldy as the groups it's supposed to discipline. You know, we may not actually find what we're looking for, but we certainly won't if we don't try. I think the need is so apparent that we need to try, and I wish you all well in the effort. Thank you very much.